Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back. Today we are doing something a little different. I am joined by Travis Newton and we are talking about Paperbacks from Hell, the twisted history of 70s and 80s horror fiction by Grady Hendrix. And the reason we are talking about this is because, one, Travis, you told me to read this and you thought I would love it, and I did.
Well, I'm glad you loved it. This may not be the first Grady Hendrix book I told you to read. I think I might have even told you to read My Best Friend's Exorcism first.
Yes, but I did them in the wrong order.
So you've read My Best Friend's Exorcism by this point?
I have not.
Ah, okay.
So I did this one first.
I eagerly await your reaction to that. But today is all about Paperbacks from Hell. Grady Hendrix really didn't surface on my author radar until My Best Friend's Exorcism. And I had read about it probably on two websites as like best horror novels of the year or something like that. So I decided to check it out and was smitten with the novel. I mean, it's so good. I've read it probably 3 times at this point and love it every time. And so I became sort of an instant Grady Hendrix fan, went right on to read his first novel, Horror Store, after I finished My Best Friend's Exorcism for the first time. And so when this project was announced, I was kind of over the moon because, you know, I was eager to see how Hendrix would write nonfiction and was really fascinated by the subject matter. This is something that I was really looking forward to, and it delivered in a big way, I think.
Yeah, I had been seeing his books on Bookstagram, if you will, because I follow a lot of those types of accounts from the Chat Sematary Instagram account.
Sure.
And so I had seen My Best Friend's Exorcism, Horror Store, this one, and, you know, his latest book, which I believe is How to Sell a Haunted House.
Yep.
Which sounds fun. I have read, I think, The Final Girl Support Group? No, maybe.
Did you read the vampire one?
I have not, but I have so many of these on my list to read. I read some Final Girl book recently, and I always get these two confused. So there's so many of them right now. I can't keep them straight. I truly cannot. I don't know how anyone else does. I am scrolling through my Goodreads to try and find it, and I'm not finding it. So maybe I just made this all up in my head and I don't know what I read.
Well, I mean, you read so many books that I can understand fully that it's just sort of being a blur. You read more than and pretty much anybody I know. So kudos to that. But let's talk about some of the stuff that this book covers. So the cover of the book advertises that as the twisted horror history of 70s and 80s horror fiction.
Yeah.
The book is actually a bit more broad reaching than that. And while the book definitely covers the 70s and 80s most heavily, it also talks about how the paperback horror scene and the horror industry kind of like fell off in the 90s.
Yeah.
The scope of that is really, really big, but I really love how Hendrix chops it up into chapters. And the ability, I think, to do that and make sense of so much wealth, because the horror industry and paperbacks was just booming throughout those decades. So for him to have that big of a grasp on this is nothing short of astounding to me. I love the way that he breaks this up, not only chronologically, but also talks about trends and fads in horror fiction at the time. The way that he is able to sort of draw lines between different art styles of covers and then also different, tropes and plots and, different, horror creatures and villains that are featured in fiction is, again, astounding.
Yeah.
The book itself, I think, is a really lovely thing to have, just like as a coffee table book, as an object, because it's so full of incredible art that you could just flip through it,
Yeah, that was a point you made when you were recommending it to me. You were like, get the physical copy, even though you and I both know I don't need more physical copies of books.
Sure. You got many shelves filled with
Yeah, I have
books.
5 nearly full shelves. I have a little bit of room left on one, but I did do the ebook for My Best Friend's Exorcism, and it's apparently some sort of like interactive kind of ebook. That's the only reason I got that one. So I'll probably read that like on my iPad, because I feel like the iPad's a little better on Kindle with interactive stuff. But this book, absolutely stunning. Just the way the cover is designed and sort of how the Paperbacks from Hell title pops off the cover. And I did find the book that I was trying to remember the name of, and it's The Last Final Girl by Stephen Graham Jones, who is an author whose name I've seen appear a lot next to Grady Hendrix is on like those Bookstagram accounts. So
Yeah, he's one of the most popular writers in horror fiction right now.
yeah, so that's where my confusion came from, because everyone has a book with Final Girl in the title, apparently.
Well, it's stuff like that Paperbacks from Hell is about, like noticing those kinds of larger trends in horror fiction. It's like, oh, everybody was writing about this at the time.
Yeah, like the moms who kept their children locked away, and you know, the Stepford wives get mentioned in this. And one of the things I loved about this book was the fact that it was not so focused on King. Yes, King gets mentioned quite a bit in this. And, you know, of course, we have to talk about the King aspect because that's what we do on this podcast. But, you know, it would mention Cujo and The Shining and how there were so many other books sort of inspired by those that it kind of, each one became its own little subgenre within horror fiction, you know, like all the deadly animals and things like that.
But he's got 2 pages devoted to killer dog stories. And yes, Cujo is mentioned at the top of the second paragraph on that, of one of those pages. But he talks about other books like Rabid and The Dogs and The Pack and The Long Dark Night and The Haven, Dog Kill, Blood Snarl, all of which have very remarkably similar covers.
Yeah.
But they all look like fun.
If anything, this book was a detriment to my TBR list.
Right, because you want to read everything that comes across in here.
Yeah, maybe not quite everything. Some of them did sound a little too weird for my taste, but a lot of them.
Well, some of them, it's like, you know, it's a Sasquatch that, you know, has remarkable sex appeal. And I'm like, that's a bridge too far, maybe.
Yeah, but the Amityvilles, give me all of the Amityvilles.
Oh, the Amityville stuff is, yeah. Some of those Amityville covers are crazy. Have you seen any of the Amityville movies, by the way?
I have seen I think it's the original with James Brolin.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that, but the second one is like gross trash. That is, if you have like very, very trashy, like Paperbacks from Hell kinds of tastes, I think Amityville 2 is more in that vein. It is shamelessly trashy and gross.
I think it's safe to say that you and I both love a fun, trashy movie at times.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And this is like, if you are in that sort of arena with trashy, like B horror movies, like this is something you have to buy.
Yeah.
I think this is something that is really going to illuminate kind of a lost history, because so many of these books have just vanished into obscurity, you know, wound up, you know, decaying to dust, or wound up, you know, donated to thrift stores and libraries. It's like these books have sort of circulated almost out of existence.
Yeah. And it's not to say that some of these aren't from popular authors. You know, you have, I think, quite a few from, you know, V.C. Andrews.
Oh, yeah.
You have some Anne Rice mentions in here, Jack Ketchum, Dan Simmons. Like, some of these are people I have read their books, just not specifically these ones necessarily. And like we were saying, King doesn't even need to get that much of a mention in here, even though, you know, one of the nice things about the fact that I kind of just stole my mom's King collection is that she had been buying the mass market paperbacks when they were first coming out. So I have some of those covers that you just don't really see anymore unless you find them at a thrift store or a library book sale or something, because as everyone who is listening to this podcast knows, King books get reprinted so often with, you know, newer covers that you don't really see the classics out in the wild quite as much. So
yeah, like the original, I have a first edition hardcover of Pet Sematary, and I love that art. And I think every subsequent cover for Pet Sematary on paperback has been so boring.
Yeah. Some are not my preference, but a lot of these too, like the spines are all cracked. So it's like, I'm very careful when I take them off the shelf to revisit them. A bunch of them are taped up, but I just can't bring myself to update them because I'm like, I don't like the covers as much.
Yeah. That's when I first started getting into my King obsession, was like 7th grade. And so a lot of the paperbacks I was coming across were from that generation of like the Paperbacks from Hell. And they had this insanely like eye-grabbing artwork. I remember the one for Christine was really great. All of the horror anthologies I had from King were from that era of printing as well. They all had the very specific old book smell. And those kinds of like tactile pleasures of reading paperbacks, I truly do miss that. You know, I love the convenience of reading stuff on my iPad or the Kindle or, you know, or whatever Kindle app I'm using, whatever device. That's always nice. And I do a lot of audiobooks now just because I'm a commuter and drive a fair bit. So it's super convenient. Like the last time I technically read Paperbacks from Hell. Like, I actually went through all the text of it, was through audio.
Okay.
And it's an entirely different experience to hear the book read.
Yeah.
Because it mostly just comes across like a list of crazy novels.
Yeah. And obviously, like you were saying, the reason for the physical copy is that visual element to it. And there are a lot of pages in this book that are literally just images of these covers, and some of them stick with you. Like, there was an image where the epilogue is, so it's at the very end, and it's just this giant pig with wing-like Dumbo ears almost.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. I have the book in my hands.
Just eating some guts. Mm-hmm. And I was like, that is an image to end on.
Well, it's a really interesting thing to look back and realize how healthy the market for paperback horror was at the time.
Yeah.
There was so much competition that really one of the only ways the books could set themselves apart and leap off of the drugstore shelves and into people's hands was like having a really remarkable, striking, terrifying image on the front. That is the reason I read so many books like this as a kid, is just like walking through the library and seeing like, this cover is really, really striking. And, you know, the hit or miss ratio, it's a lot of misses, frankly, because like often books can't really deliver on the cover value, where it's like there's no way anything in the book is as interesting or striking as something in that cover. But I think Hendrix has done a really great job of curating the books that do match up with the audacity and like the interest that the cover promises.
Yeah, I noticed that when I was reading through it too. I was like, oh, he really hand selected like the ones he thinks that people would want to read because they match. They aren't going to necessarily be the best thing you've ever read, but if you are looking at the covers to these books and you're like, this is what I'm expecting, he picked the ones where it's like, this is what you're going to get.
Yeah. He does a really, really great job with curation. That's one of the real victories of this book, is like you come away with a huge list of things like, oh man, the way he describes this, I simply have to read it.
Yeah.
And he doesn't avoid saying that something is like trashy or bad.
He sure doesn't. And I love it.
Yeah. Well, he talks about like the series of novels from like the authors like William W. Johnstone, where it's like, oh, it's this ultra gross machismo. And there's a lot to be turned off by in the descriptions, where it's like, yeah, that does sound gross and icky, but it still manages to pique the curiosity in a way where you're like, I can't believe the market was in that sort of condition where that was doing so well. And like there was a big market for that, where he could have this, you know, somebody like Johnstone could have this career. And so these authors, a lot of them were just prolific. It's like, okay, yeah, this time it's going to be about mutant crabs. And oh, guess what? There are like 4 or 5 giant mutant crab books in this series by the same author, and they all have incredible covers.
Yeah, and some of these descriptions make you think these could have been short stories instead.
Yeah, it really makes me wonder on quite a few of these premises, like how they stretch out to novel length. One of the cool offshoots and, you know, the side effects that this book has had, and, you know, and its success has generated, is that some of these books are now being republished under the Paperbacks from Hell brand.
I have noticed that.
And I've seen some pushback on this, being like, look, I used to be able to find these books in the thrift store for 50 cents, and now they're being sold to me for like $13. It's like, well, yeah, they're being reprinted.
Yeah.
And I understand that, you know, yes, you can find these in some places, but I think the publicity that the reprinting brings is important. It's important that we look back on when the horror scene was in some aspects a lot healthier and more varied than it is today. That's not to say it was still full of repetitive and derivative garbage, because I mean, you look at some of these pages and clearly it was. But the fact that some of these premises became popular novels and even popular series is beyond my understanding of what horror has become or what horror is today and how it functions today as an industry. Yeah,
and honestly, I just popped open my Thrift Books app here real quick, and I just picked Michael McDowell because that was a name I could easily remember. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the first Blackwater book is going for over $40 on Thrift Books. So yeah, it's not super easy for people to necessarily find these if they want to read them. And I imagine after this book came out, a lot of people were probably trying to seek out some of these books that are very hard to find now, if you can even find them at all. And, you know, I go to a bunch of library sales. That's how I've ended up with 5 bookshelves full of books. And for the most part, you go to the horror section, if they even have one, it's probably a lot of King, which I have no complaints about, obviously, but I already have all the books, so that doesn't really help me. Or you'll find Dean Koontz and, maybe a handful of other authors, but you're not necessarily seeing stuff that is quite as obscure as some of the stuff that's in here. And I think it's just because, one, speaking for myself at least, I wasn't even aware of most of these books going into this. Sure, like I said, V.C. Andrews, Anne Rice, and some of the other people, yeah, I've heard of them. And I know their books are more easily accessible. But for some of these, like even some of the ones on the cover, like Night Shriek, no idea where I would be able to find that.
Yeah, and I really kind of lament the loss of this in the industry because publishing works so differently now than it ever did, now that there are so few big publishers.
Yeah.
They've all gobbled each other up in the name of capitalism. But there's no shortage of horror authors in the contemporary sphere. But now that so many of them are going self-published and unedited and putting their stuff up on the Kindle store, it's like, okay, maybe there's a book out there, now in the contemporary realm. It's like that kind of approaches this, but
yeah,
it's never going to get the kind of professional treatment it did back when these were being published, and you could literally buy them in, drugstores and grocery stores. I mean, they were that ubiquitous.
Yeah, and you need a big publisher for that.
Oh, yeah. And the fact that they've disappeared, does make me mourn for the state of the industry because, sure, again, it was filled with lots of derivative stuff and bad stuff, but the sheer audacity of a lot of it and the variance of the premises, just how varied they were and how inventive a lot of them were. I miss that. And I really wish there was a kind of curation like Paperbacks from Hell for contemporary horror. Because, so many bookstores don't even offer horror as a section. So many libraries don't even offer horror as a section.
Oh, yeah.
The Apple bookstore, both for audio and for the ebooks, does not have a horror section.
It's wild because Stephen King has not suddenly become less popular by any stretch of the imagination. And you could say the same for other horror authors like, Grady Hendrix, super popular. Stephen Graham Jones, we mentioned earlier, super popular. People are still buying Shirley Jackson books. I mean, come on. And the fact that horror is kind of being treated this way has sort of pushed me in a different direction. Like I had on Sadie Hartman, who is one of the co-founders of a horror book subscription club. So they don't send boxes technically, but it's like a horror box subscription club. And, they work with big publishers, but they also work with a bunch of small publishers. So I've come across a lot of small horror specific publishing companies. And sure, like you said, they're not going to necessarily get stuff in all of the stores or anything along those lines, but it's kind of been drawing me more to those authors who are on smaller publishers because you can tell that there are so many people in the horror community who care about this topic in particular that we're discussing, with horror kind of being thrown by the wayside for whatever reason, even though, Halloween movies are still coming out. and
or just not being called horror.
Yeah.
Literature, I think
thrillers.
There's still so much in the publishing, in the publishing realm that just wants to be taken more seriously because it's written, and movies are content to call themselves horror. But for some reason, so many bookstores, whether brick and mortar or ebooks, are really hesitant to develop a horror section.
Yeah.
But it's really nice when they do. And, us talking about the subscription model and talking about word of mouth among fans, that really shows you just how much the business model of horror publishing has changed, where it's like, finding the smaller authors is now reliant on that. It is now reliant on authors, purchasing that sponsored, the sponsored recommendation slot on the Amazon page for their self-published novel. And the lack of like QA and editing and that kind of stuff really makes me hesitant to read a lot of it, because I've read some of these like self-published horror books. If back when I first got a Kindle, It ain't this, that's for sure.
Yeah. That's why I've kind of been leaning towards smaller publishers. Like, are you familiar with Max Booth III?
Nope.
So Max Booth III is someone who has written quite a bit of horror, and he has appeared in like Lit Reactor crime reads and some of those sort of big writer websites, if you will. And, you know, he does some work with Ghoulish Books, which is an indie press sort of thing. And I'm pretty sure he runs Perpetual Motion Machine, which is where he releases his own books. And they have some other authors. And I bought like a few ebooks from them when they were running a sale or something. And I unfortunately haven't read them just yet. But a lot of these kind of have like the Paperbacks from Hell kind of vibe to them. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to send you one of the titles right now on Skype here. And awesome. I will link to it in the show notes for everyone as well, just so you can be aware and see that. And, you know, they kind of have this vintage vibe to them for some of these covers. And you are right. You have to still do that thing where you grab someone's attention, because if your name isn't Stephen King, that's just what you got to do. Yeah.
There's also, you know, this one, Touch the Night by Max Booth III, has a sort of retro styling that the show Stranger Things has taken advantage of. You know, the typography or the logo type that Stranger Things uses is designed to evoke that Paperbacks from Hell logo type feel.
Yeah.
Like when My Best Friend's Exorcism was first published, it didn't have that kind of cover. It had a much more modern cover, a sort of understated cover. It's still effective. But like when they published the paperback version, it is like full on retro VHS cover artwork, like Paperbacks from Hell. It's beautiful.
I love it.
Yeah. So I really like the stylings of that kind of stuff. Another publisher that deserves some credit for going back into horror fiction and horror publishing and like doing genre stuff is Tor. They've started their brand Nightfire that publishes a lot of horror stuff, and they're becoming a horror brand. I'm glad to see Tor putting special attention to horror like that. It's good. They were one of the publishers that gets talked about quite a bit in Paperbacks from Hell. So
yeah, and I just highly recommend, even if you can't afford to subscribe to their package every month, but follow Nightworms on either Twitter or Instagram, and you'll just discover so many new horror authors and books. And I've received a few packages from them, not too many, because if I subscribed, I would literally just run out of room tomorrow, probably. And, you know, they do a great job of, like this book, sort of curating 2 to 3 books a month for horror fans. And again, honestly, if I signed up, I wouldn't even be able to keep up with reading. I haven't even read all of the ones I got from them already. So I've just discovered a lot through following them on Instagram when they do their reveals for the packages. And both Sadie and Ashley post a lot of their book collections. So it's been terrible for my TBR like this book was, but I love it.
I hear you. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about with Paperbacks from Hell? I think I've said everything I want to say about it, aside from buy this. This is something you need on your coffee table. It's so cool.
Yeah, look, I will also have a link to buy this from either Bookshop or Amazon, maybe both, in the show notes. But if you just want something that's a fun read, like this isn't something you have to think super hard about. It's not like reading a business book or trying to keep track of all the characters in Under the Dome or something, you know?
No, it's not dry. It is not a challenging read at all.
Right.
It is super fun. And if you were just to listen to the text as an audiobook, it would come across as like, oh, this is just a short list of fun books. But really having it as an object in your hands and being able to pair the text with the artwork and so on. Awesome. Awesome stuff.
Yeah. Highly recommend this. Travis, thank you so much for recommending it to me. I promise, read My Best Friend's Exorcism soon. My reading is easing up. I did accidentally put too many holds for ebooks at the library, and they all checked out at the same time. And I was like, thank you. I will do my best to finish all of these in 3 weeks.
Okay.
Story of my life. So, but Best Friend's Exorcism, I will bump it up on the list now that I have read this and know how much I enjoy Grady Hendrix.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks again for having me on, Deanna. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Anytime. I'm sure you'll be back for something else in the future. Maybe we'll do My Best Friend's Exorcism here too.
Sounds good.